Hello, my name is Dalen Wilkins and I'm a software engineer at DoltHub. Today we're going to go over how to set up your Dolt database to take advantage of the new privilege system. I'm going to assume that Dolt has already been installed, but if needed, download links and instructions are in the GitHub repository, which is linked in the description. To get started, let's create a Dolt database. Dolt takes its current folder as a database name, so we'll create a folder named dbname for the sake of example. Next, we'll initialize our Dolt directory, just as you would a Git directory. The Dolt SQL command allows us to run SQL statements directly against our database from the command line. So first, let's create a table and name example. Next, we'll insert a few values into our new table. Now let's create another table, name it example2. And just like our last table, we'll insert a few rows into it. Alright, now we're going to run our Dolt database as a server. This is accomplished using the Dolt SQL Server command. In order to use the privilege system, the database must be running as a server. All statements run outside of the server context, such as the earlier Dolt SQL command, completely ignore the privilege system. This is because you need file level access to the database to run any commands on the command line, therefore you already have direct access to the data. Let's get our server up and running. I'm going to provide a few options here and I'll go over what they mean. Our privilege file argument specifies the file that we want to load and save our privilege data to. If the file does not already exist, then it's created. If the file contains any data, then we use that data. And if the file is empty, which it is in our case, we use the next two parameters as the basis of our default super account. The user argument specifies the name of that super account, which will be root in our case, and the password argument specifies the password, which will be 123, which is a password I would hope no one would ever use for a live database. Now, this default super account is important as the database needs at least one account for someone to connect to. Otherwise, the database would be completely inaccessible. However, if other accounts exist, such as in the privilege file, we do not create the super account, and the user and password parameters are ignored. Now let's connect to our root account through a MySQL client. Dolt comes with one built in via the SQL client command, so we can use that one in our other terminal. On the left, you'll see that our connection has shown up, and on the right, you'll see that we are now connected. So let's set up a user and a role. So we've created a user named Tester and given him the password 123. We granted our user the select privilege on our example table. Make sure to name the database as well. Next, we create a role named test role. And lastly, we grant the role select, insert, update, and delete privileges on all databases and tables. This applies not only to the current databases and tables, but any future databases and tables that may exist or may be created later. Now we've exited our session as root. It's worth mentioning that our default super account is saved along with our new user in the privilege file. So let's log in as our new user and see some examples. The use statement sets the default database for us, so we don't have to include it in every statement. Here we see the data we inserted into example from earlier, and just as we expect, as we have the select privilege on our database or on our example table, the data shows up. Now you'll see that we get an access denied error on the other table as we do not have any privileges for this table. What's interesting is that since we only have access to that singular table example, we can't even try and see if other tables exist. Let's run a select on a table that we know does not exist. Here you can see it's the same exact error. Let's try a different command and see what happens. Now we get a command denied error as we don't have the insert privilege for this table. Let's try granting our role to our user. So first we'll need to log back in as root. Then we can grant our role to our user. Okay, now let's log back in as our user. We can select from our example table just to make sure that it still works as expected. Okay, great, all is working and just as we'd expect. No error this time. Our role gives us the select privilege on every table of every database, so this now works. Now let's try it with our non-existent table from earlier. Now we get a table not found error instead of the access denied error. This is a useful distinction, as if the table existed, we would have access to it, so we can simply state that it does not exist. We'll try our insert statement from earlier as well. And it all works. You can see our data is now in the example table, just as we would hope. And this is due, of course, to the role having the new insert privilege. So now let's remove our role from the user. So we'll need to log back in as root. Just as the grant command is used to add privileges and roles, the revoke command can be used to undo added privileges or roles. So now we need to log back to the user to see our results. As you can see, we still have access to our example table. And we get our access denied error again. So the privileges that a role has do not replace the privileges granted directly to a user, they only add to them. So feel free, of course, to assign as many roles as needed and revoke those roles when they're no longer needed to your users, as it will not affect any privileges granted directly to those users. It is worth noting, though, of course, that if you do grant any privileges to those users, they will not be overridden by a role not having those privileges, as an example. So make sure that any privileges granted specifically to a user are intended for that user to have, regardless of other roles that may be given to them. And that's it. We've walked through the basics of setting up a Dolt database to use our new privilege system. If you're interested in learning more about the privilege system, we've got a link to the documentation in the video details. Thank you for watching.